Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Field research stations are crucial to reaching global biodiversity targets, but they are often absent or invisible to the conversation on global environmental policy, a Nature paper released last November says. Here to discuss what that means, the importance of field research stations, is wildlife ecologist, National Geographic explorer, and director of Osa Conservation, Andy Whitworth. Author of some op-eds for Mongabay, Andy provides me an update on his work, such as the largest camera trap study ever in Central America, and other projects Osa Conservation is working on. We also discuss the larger success of conservation and reforestation in Costa Rica, and what he says the international community needs to be paying attention to and learning from its success. All right, so hi, Andy. Thanks for joining me. Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. How are you?
I'm very good, Mike. It's great to be speaking to you.
And where are you joining us from, Andy?
I'm down in the field station in Costa Rica in the South Pacific on the Osa Peninsula. So I'm looking out my office right now over the rainforest and the Pacific Ocean.
That sounds beautiful. And actually, that's quite germane to what we're talking about today. So there was a paper published in Nature last November that says that research stations are key to meeting global biodiversity targets. And yet, research stations are invisible to global environmental policy. So I was wondering if you could tell us about research stations. Why are they so important? And in your opinion, what does it mean when they say they're invisible?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's a topic that's really close to my heart. So I spent the last 15 years living and working in kind of research and conservation stations in the field in the tropics. And but field stations have a long history, like almost some of the oldest field stations were established over almost a century ago, even older. And they've kind of been these almost like pioneer frontiers to allow researchers to explore the wildest places on Earth and allow us to explore with a scientific lens what's actually in these wild places and how these wild places function. And so they're incredibly important for kind of taking the pulse of what's going on with the planet. And so in a nutshell, that's kind of like why they're important. But in their complete history, they've always been these kind of frontier places that are usually underfunded, struggling to survive. And now, more than ever, in a time and a moment with both the climate and the biodiversity crisis, when you think that we need field stations more than ever, there are field stations around the world that are constantly under threat of being closed and kind of becoming irrelevant. And that's a scary thing that's happening.
And so can you give us a couple of examples where field research stations impacted a region or helped protect some of that biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, thinking, I mean, if we think from a tropical perspective, which obviously is where a lot of my experience is, like one of the most famous field stations that I've worked in or been a part of was in Costa Rica, right in the heart of Manu National Park, which is where the great ecologist John Turbo produced a lot of the literature around tropical ecosystems and trophic cascades. And his research really came out of this, what I would call almost like a pristine benchmark of a tropical Amazonian forest system. And that came out of Costa Rica. But then like closer to home for people in the US, like Archbold Research Station, which has been going for over 80 years now, down in Florida and collecting incredible long-term data sets around changing ecosystems and changing climates.
And so when these research stations when they become invisible, so to speak, are they being ignored by global environmental policy? In what way are they getting shortchanged?
Well, I think that this is something that's not particularly new. I think field stations have typically always struggled to survive. They're often in these remote wilderness areas, and it's probably got increasingly harder to get universities to kind of want to recognize the importance of these field stations and investing in them, and particularly in areas that we need them. So, like I've said, the goal of a field station is to provide enough infrastructure to allow scientists to go in and learn about some of our remotest, wildest, and most rugged landscapes. And it's often expensive to kind of set up the facilities in these remote systems. And then it's all about the management and keeping them operating. And, the truth is that like scientists and students don't pay, right? So it's like an investment in the science. And so I think that it's been challenging for field stations to kind of figure out how they're going to survive in this kind of underfunded landscape. And so you see modern day field stations kind of chasing funds sometimes towards ecotourism to bring bird watchers or ecotourists through the doors, and they kind of lose the focus of the mission around science. And I think that although there's this wealth of funding out there right now, probably more money than there's ever been, right, to invest in nature conservation. And we're hearing about these bigger, announcements of investments in nature, but it's all around the creation of new hectares. The focus is new national parks, new hectares to try and get things established. But there's very little investment in the long-term protection of protected areas. Not only the protection, but then the monitoring and the understanding about what's going on in those landscapes. And there's a few great examples of kind of national parks that have been established 50 years ago. Like there's an incredible park in Bolivia called Noel Camp, and it was established around 40 years ago. But it's pretty much a forgotten park now. There's no investment from NGOs. It's kind of an abandoned park. There's no facilities. And so there's no science or knowledge being generated about how that park's actually doing and how the wildlife is doing and how the park's changing in terms of a changing climate. And a bit closer to home for me on the Osa Peninsula, Corcovado National Park was established in the 70s. And the main centre of the park where the tourists visit now is called Sirena Biological Station. But it's not a biological station. There are no scientists based there doing research and monitoring. When I arrived here 7 years ago, it was clear that there was a huge paucity of data in terms of how healthy was this park, what's actually going on to the wildlife populations, is the conservation establishment of protected areas even working at all?
And so if anyone listening to this podcast or are out there, like hypothetically, if they were listening right now, who had who held the keys to open up some of this funding for research stations, what would your message to them be?
Well, I think if we want to look at those big goals, the sustainable development goals, particularly the ones related to environment and understanding our conservation actions and how our systems are doing, if we're going to help governments do that, especially in the biodiverse, rich tropical countries, then we need the basic infrastructure to be able to answer that question so that governments in tropical countries can actually provide information towards international targets and answer the question of, is our conservation action and our investment in nature actually having the impact that we want it to do? And so that's a basic question on a global level. And then you get to this like micro level, which is, where are our young people, young ecologists, going to spend time in nature learning about the most precious ecosystems on Earth? And I would argue that over the last decade or so, I've met a lot of people working in some of the biggest, most important conservation organizations on our planet right now, who probably couldn't walk into most ecosystems on Earth and actually tell you whether they're healthy or not. And so I think it's absolutely critical that although we have technology and we can work with remote sensing and we can work on meta-analysis and big data sets and fly drones, we need a good level of base field ecologists that can go out and understand how a healthy system actually works. We need people that know what it's like to be surrounded by 300 white-lipped peccaries and know that there's some kind of important function of that species. just by observing how it interacts with its environment. And that's not something that you can ever get from remote sensing and a laptop.
So, switching gears a little bit, but what other benefits do research stations provide that you wish got more press attention? What are some of these? What are some of the more underappreciated aspects of research stations?
Absolutely. I mean, so we've talked about number one, which is like why field stations started, which was allow the scientific lens into these incredible places and provide long-term monitoring. But I kind of touched on it just there, which is kind of these incubators of not just young ecologists, but conservationists, and hopefully people that are going to end up as decision makers in policy will have been able to experience and see firsthand these incredible ecosystems. And so I think the modern day field station and what we've been doing here in Osa is moving away from just being a field station. So we call our place the Conservation Campus, which has a biological field station, but it also has facilities that anybody can visit. And the goal is that, I hope someday, like a future Minister of Environment will have spent time in, a baseline primary rainforest and have that understanding of what it feels like to be within one. But then the other big focus I think that we've worked really hard at when I came here is to not just have a field station where you've got lots of visiting academics coming in and collecting data on really important things around cognition and ecosystem function, but building our own in-house conservation and science team so that we can ask the questions about what's important for this landscape and how our field station has an impact for conservation on our surrounding landscape and the species that are in this landscape. So that allows us to build our own conservation action team. So our program here has 5 tree nurseries at different levels from the mountains down to the ocean. We're planting over 100,000 native trees every year. And our botanists get involved with that restoration work by including very rare and endemic and threatened tree species. So you see this blending of science and conservation action. And I would say the final important piece on top of all of this is that you can use it and leverage it to generate economic opportunities. So our field station is creating just over 80 jobs now in our organization, and over half of those are local jobs and 3/4 Costa Rican national jobs. So we're supporting a huge number of local families and have a much bigger influence on other local businesses around us as well. So you can use field stations to kind of stimulate economies around these national parks and very remote regions where economic opportunities are probably most needed.
I want to talk about something that you and your team have been working on. Actually, in 2021, we reported on something that you were working on, the largest camera trap study in Central America, which occurred on the Osa Peninsula, where you said the data collected showed conservation efforts are working. So I want to get an update on that from you. But first, can you just tell our listeners what the project was and what you initially found?
Absolutely. So that's a great case in point example. And I kind of first landed down here on the Osa in around, I think it was 2017. And I realized very quickly that the last time any kind of large scale research on the large megafauna at any kind of scale was done in the late 80s, not long after maybe a decade after the park had been established. And at that point, they'd found that a lot of the big megafauna was restricted right in the heart of the national park. So tapirs, collared peccaries, pumas, jaguars, they were all restricted to a very small place right in the heart of Corcovado, and there was almost nothing found outside of the park. So we got together with all kinds of different institutions, the government first and foremost, and the protected area managers, who don't have the funds and resources to carry out the kind of monitoring. This is exactly what I was saying. So our role as a field station and a campus was to talk to the park about their needs. And then we leveraged all the kinds of different partners around us, other NGOs, hotels even. We got everybody involved to try and cover this peninsula in camera traps. So it was a huge effort. I think it was over 200 camera traps at the time. And what we found was, since that data that we collected in the 80s, there was a huge recovery in most of the wildlife species. Tapirs, collared peccaries, pumas had exploded beyond the park boundaries, and they were now occupying some of the smaller national parks and a lot of the wildlife corridors. But it also told us that jaguars and white peccaries are they're not crashing, but they're still kind of restricted to the park and just the outskirts of the boundaries. So it was just hugely important in allowing us to get involved in answering some questions about how conservation was working in this region.
And so how are things, it's almost been about 2 years since we reported on that project. So has anything changed since then, or is anything developed interesting that you want people to know about?
Well, we haven't kind of redone that study yet. So we'd populations take a long time to change. So we'll probably redo that in a few years when we want another snapshot of what's going on. But what we do year on year is we answer different questions. So since then, we've been doing camera trap surveys around some of the major highways to understand what might be the big barriers to dispersal for key species like white-lipped peccary. We've been looking at with big surveys from the ocean to the mountaintop. So looking at how the peninsula itself connects to the big Amistad National Park up in the Talamanca Mountains, because those are the kind of closest populations to other jaguar populations and peccary populations. And so we're kind of we're using this research to guide our conservation efforts. So most of our conservation, I would say 10 years ago, was focused on our own private reserve, our own landscape of 3,000 hectares. And now over half of our employees are actually based in communities all the way up to the mountaintop. We're really working at trying to reconnect these biological corridors from Osa's lowlands to the mountaintop. So a lot of that research has really allowed us to grow and expand our conservation action. And we're able to keep collecting data around this conservation action to now ask questions about, is it actually working?
So here's an interesting question that I had, which may highlight that benefit of field stations that you're talking about. You stated in a commentary with us that you want to see global reforestation projects include tree diversity instead of as opposed to just planting either non-native or just one type of tree species in a place. I'd like to talk about why is this so important? What are the benefits from taking this approach, from incorporating tree diversity?
I suppose the most important answer to that is, and we've got very little data from the tropics because research is limited, but our peninsula, for example, has over 700 species of tree recorded, and I wish that we could do more, but like our tree nursery here on the Osa is approaching around 200 species, so we're close to around 28% or so of the tree diversity of the peninsula. But the reality is that most reforestation programs are driven by, I would say, by foresters. It comes more from the timberlands and the common species, and usually a handful of species. But if we want to think about really resilient ecosystems, we're not always sure about, in a changing climate, which species are going to adapt and do well. So if we had the data and the science mapped out on these mega rich regions, which species would do well and where, we could obviously plan really well. But in the absence of having time and being able to do all that science, what we do know is that we should plant forests with as much richness and diversity as possible, so that those species will kind of figure out what's going to survive and what isn't. So it's really important, if we want to think about wildlife populations and thinking about what's going to do well in a future climate, we need to focus on diverse landscapes. And high tree diversity is likely to result in high biodiversity in general, because we're going to provide a diversity of food resources for wildlife. And the one thing that we don't want to end up with low diverse tree plantations is an empty forest that has poor refugia and food resources for wildlife.
Obviously, reforestation is a really positive thing, but it's not like a rubber stamp that you can just apply everywhere, and it takes this unique approach depending on your location. Some folks tell me, well, at least we can help restore rainforests when they get degraded. But I was hoping you could sort of illustrate the challenge behind this and how much effort it takes to actually reforest a degraded rainforest. What kind of time scale does that take, and what kind of effort does that take, and what's the likelihood of success on something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of my PhD research revolved around the value of secondary forests and how much biodiversity could recover. And I was actually looking at areas in South America, in the Amazon, and I was looking at areas in what we call like a good context. So areas that maybe hadn't been degraded for too long, they were still relatively close to source populations of animals. And what you find typically is even within around 50 years in a tropical region, you can get up and around 80% of biodiversity that recovers. But we still have some really sensitive species that tend not to recover or could take, hundreds of years. But in most contexts, you can get to quite a high diversity of forest within just 50 years. But it's all context specific. We could have some areas that are heavily degraded for maybe 100 years or more, and they're in a context where there's no nearby source populations of animals to help that process. And then I think there needs to be even more human intervention to make those areas recover. There's a big debate, right, about natural regeneration versus tree planting. I think it's kind of one of those old debates that's a little bit like, well, why do you need to choose one? There's two tools that are probably both very useful in different circumstances. And so on the very edges of pristine areas, natural recovery probably has extremely high potential. But there are areas where we maybe need human intervention to speed up the processes, whether it be actually thinking about regenerating the soil, which is very rarely done. The desire is to always go straight to tree planting, not actually think about how we're going to do soil recovery before we start planting trees. And then how are you going to bring back the wildlife? And you might need to do more than just allow it to come back naturally.
And so segueing into an example where that wildlife is starting to come back, you talked about the reintroduction of the Harpy eagle in Costa Rica, or at least it was seen for at least the first photographic evidence of it in, I believe, 20 years. Can you explain to our listeners the significance of this sighting and what that means? Like what kind of success does this show?
Yeah, I mean, so that was in the north of the country, this Harpy eagle that came back in. And what I noticed was how excited everybody in Costa Rica got. Even the Minister of Environment was tweeting about how proud he was to see this animal back in. But he was probably a vagrant bird, right, that had come in from the big national park just over the border. And so it's a kind of sign that people are excited. Things have changed enough in Costa Rica since 40, 50 years ago when birds like that would have been killed and persecuted, to a point now where there's enough pride in Costa Rica around environment, around wild species, that people want to see animals like that back again. And I think more than anything, it's a sign not that Harpy eagles are actually recovering in the country, but I think it's a sign that we have a great potential to rewild some of those lost species that haven't made their way back really over the past 30 or 40 years. And there's a big opportunity there in Costa Rica to get on the front foot and do some proactive recovery of lost species. Harpy eagles, just one example. Another one would be the giant anteater that's been gone from Costa Rica for a similar time. And there's been very successful reintroductions of giant anteater in other countries. And one project now I think is that if we want to help those jaguars and white peccaries in Colorado, what we need to do is actually help to translocate some of those white peccaries into some of the national parks where they've been lost and haven't made their way back. And that's going to help jaguars recover, because then you're helping to recover the food base. So I think it's an exciting moment for Costa Rica, where they've recovered a lot of the forest because of their environmental leadership. And a lot of wildlife was naturally recovered. But now's the time to kind of take real proactive steps to put back some of those important key apex species.
Right. I was actually going to ask you about that, and you sort of just answered my next question, which was, about rewilding in terms of, bringing back some of the other species. And so my big question then, given this sort of the success that's happened here, is this sort of like, the shot of hope that the rest of the world needs to see to think, hey, this is possible. You can bring biodiversity and wildlife back from the brink, because as we discussed, reforestation is really difficult, takes a lot of time, but 20 years is not a very long time in cosmic terms. And already, you're saying we're seeing progress and payoff from that effort in Costa Rica. So, is this sort of does this portend some hope and some other action elsewhere? And if so, where?
Absolutely. I think what it shows is that nature, although we can perceive it as very fragile, and we've done a lot of damage all over the world, it is undoubted. But what we do see is that once we make the right steps and we kind of give nature space to recover and even give it help in hand, it's extremely resilient. And we've seen that time and time again. I mean, when I was growing up, we heard about nothing but the challenges around the ozone. We don't hear about that now, and it's like one of the biggest success stories in terms of how humans could very quickly reverse some big environmental crisis that seemed so looming and dark, and then all of a sudden we made steps in consumerism and policy. Suddenly repaired a huge environmental issue. So the planet's extremely resilient. We just need to make the right steps. And it's hugely important to have working examples and case studies around the world to prove that these things can be done at scale.
Obviously, Costa Rica has benefited a lot from ecotourism, and it's fair for folks to point out that other places in the world that have high rates of tropical deforestation are not Costa Rica, and therefore face different challenges. But I would just like to point out that Costa Rica used to have one of the highest rates of deforestation in the world in the 1980s. But now, according to the World Bank, it's the first tropical nation to reverse that deforestation. And other than ecotourism, I was wondering if there was another underappreciated aspect of Costa Rica's success that you think other nations or regions need to put more emphasis on in their planning. What is working here that you think could be replicated elsewhere, like right now, in your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question, and these are kind of the things I wanted to learn when I was coming from my experience working in the Amazon. I wanted to understand what had been key to Costa Rica's success. And I have to say, after living and working here for a while, it's really clear about the investment that Costa Rica made in its education. So just generally, the investment in the country in good education and education around pride in natural ecosystems is really visible. And there's a huge sense of pride in the Ticos about their wild landscapes. And I would say the other piece that's been very successful for Costa Rica, and we have to think about this on a global level, is pretty good political stability, which is not something easy to just replicate. But I remember speaking with Carlos Manuel, who's the ex-Minister of Environment, now head of the Global Environment Facility. And he said one of the key steps was building the links between the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Agriculture, and actually putting them in the same department and them having to sit down on a weekly basis and talk rather than being completely separate units. So I think there's a lot to look at in terms of Costa Rica on a political level as well, in terms of its dynamics of how it's made conservation function on a political level.
Well, Andy, is there anything else in the last couple of minutes we have here, anything else that you're working on, in your organization, Osa Conservation, that you want listeners to take a look at and pay attention to?
Well, I would just say, like, we're in a moment right now. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier where there's more money than ever in terms of conservation, in terms of hectares. And I think it's a moment to really think, I would say, to get some of these big organizations that have got access to those funds is to and people who are putting up their money for conservation is to think about, what do you want to happen to these protected areas 50 years from now? Do you want them to end up like forgotten parks like Knoll Kent and not have a clue about what's happening within them? Or do you want to make them thriving landscapes that help to generate economies for local people and give us the data that we need to say whether our actions are working? And if we want that, then we need to invest in it along with the creation of protected areas. We need to invest in the long-term management and protection, and we need to invest in the long-term monitoring of those areas. And I think that it's a forgotten investment. And I think that to me is really the key piece about the paper that you mentioned, that you sent to me, the fear of these field stations becoming invisible when they have really a really precious role to play in it, more than ever going ahead in the future.
All right, Andy, where can people find more information on your work or on Osa Conservation? Any websites or social media handles that you want people to look for?
Absolutely. We're on all the socials. We're on Insta and Twitter, and it's just at Osa Conservation. And you can find our website, which is www.osaconservation.org. And you can look us up and come and visit.
Yeah, I'll be sure to make it out there hopefully if I can cross the Pacific Ocean again one of these days. All right, Andy, thank you so much for joining.
Super. Thanks, Mike.
If you want to learn more about Osa Conservation or you want to read Andy's thoughts and commentaries on Mongabay, find the links here in the show notes of this podcast. And as always, if you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast and you want to help us out, you can spread the word by telling a friend about the show, because that's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. But if you want, you can always support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. As we are a non-profit news outlet, even just $1 per month will really help us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And as always, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, find Mongabay on most of the social platforms out there, including Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Mastodon, and others, with the handle at Mongabay, or on Twitter at Mongabay.org, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thanks, as always, for listening.